Hi, this is the first of some talks I'm going to give about the author Donald Westlake. Donald Westlake was a genre fiction writer, mostly crime fiction, whose career began in the early 60s and extended until his death around 2007. He wrote more than 100 books that were published under many pseudonyms, and he is probably best remembered in the field for his books that center around a character called Parker. He wrote 24 books about Parker. He wrote 16 of them in the late 60s and early 70s, roughly two a year for 8 years. And then he let the character go for a while, and 20 years later, he brought him back for 8 more volumes and was still working on them at the time of his death. Westlake was wrote the Parker books under the name Richard Stark. He used a lot of different pseudonyms for commercial reasons, and the Parker books have a very distinct tone that the name Richard Stark sort of fits. Uh, the first one was called The Hunter, and it was turned into a very successful movie called Point Blank, starring Lee Marvin playing the Parker role, and directed by John Borman. Westlake had a arrangement that any Parker book of his that might be adapted for movies or television, which a few were, couldn't use the name Parker. They had to rename the character. I think he was trying to protect himself from any commercial damage that might happen if the film turned out to be pretty bad. He wanted a little distance between the books that originated the series and the adaptations that might be made out of them. Okay, that's probably enough about the sort of background. The Parker books are crime novels. They're not mystery novels, and they're not thrillers. They are, although they have thriller elements here and there, they are books about a criminal. Parker is that criminal, and they're told third person. They have a fairly strong formula that eventually got pretty regularized by Westlake, and they focus on Parker attempting to perform a complex robbery or crime. They usually have like 4 parts, each of which will focus on a different aspect, and Westlake is able to take this basic formula and give it a great deal of variation that sort of keeps the series interesting. But the main thing that holds interest is the character of Parker himself. Parker is one of the least internal characters probably ever written. He has virtually no inner life. We never really see inside his head. We learn very, very little, minuscule amounts about his past. He has no real inner life. He's almost completely motivated by the desire to complete these crimes. And these crimes are about money. He's always trying to do some kind of complex robbery, usually as part of a larger group, although occasionally, of course, by himself. And then dealing with the consequences of trying to complete those robberies, because of course things go wrong. But he is just narrowly focused on this. He's motivated by this need to complete these crimes, with virtually no exception. Westlake in general is probably one of the chief writers in American literature to focus on the motive of money. Although money, of course, comes into play in other fictions, almost never is it just so absolutely central as it is in Westlake's fiction. It's the central motive of his main characters. It's often the central motive of his side characters, or just these little characters who are barely in one scene. And it drives the action to a very high degree. And even when other motives come into play. Parker, for example, is sometimes motivated by revenge. There's usually at least something of a pragmatic cast to it. Parker doesn't just want vengeance for vengeance sake um, all the time. He wants vengeance so that everyone will know. He wants it to be known vengeance so that everyone who might interfere with his desire to rob is eliminated. They are barriers to the larger goal. The larger goal being to remain a criminal and remain a thief. And this doesn't actually come up that often, even in crime fiction. In crime fiction, although the money or might be a bit of an inciting incident, there usually turns out to be larger motives, like working out psychoses, dealing with issues surrounding family or loyalty or self-protection. But in Westlake, it is just a pure, simple need for money. That's what moves. That's what moves the dial. That's what keeps the action rolling. And Parker is very narrowly focused on this. He never loses track of what matters. He, in his efforts, once he's established that something is no longer a threat to the money or to his ability to get the money, he drops it. Um, he's one of these characters who's young enough to be sort of like really physically active. You get the sense he's like in his early 40s, but he's experienced enough also to sort of not be easily fooled and to sort of keep his mind on his job. Westlake once said that he saw Parker as you're reading about a workman doing his job. His job happens to be armed robbery, but like that's the pleasure of the fiction, is you're reading about someone who's good at his job, trying to do it, and his job is intrinsically dramatic. So you get sequences where Parker is careful and carefully plans and thinks things through. It's just that because he's a criminal, some actions are available to him that aren't available to most people. Parker is not he's not unaware of other people's existence, but he generally treats them like objects, friend or foe or neutral. They are generally treated based on their ability to help or hinder the main goal. So, for example, there's a situation in one of the books where one of the crew has been caught by the police, and they are in a position to abandon this person and just get away with the swag. But a couple members of the crew really don't want to do that. This person who's in police custody really matters to them, and Parker has nothing against them, and if left to himself he would probably just leave, but he's aware that his participation in this wider criminal underworld and his ability to put together crews for future jobs depends on him showing loyalty and willingness to take risks. It doesn't reach him personally. He doesn't really understand that degree of personal loyalty, or if he does, he doesn't show it. But he is aware that others are motivated by it, and so he agrees to help get this person out of police custody, because it's an investment in his ability to do future jobs. It is fascinating to watch someone so narrowly focused on their own their safety and then their own work, especially when their work implicitly allows them to do violence. Parker is also aware that violence is a hazard to himself, and so he often plans more than he would otherwise. Perhaps he could often take shortcuts if he would use violence more. He's perfectly willing to use violence, including lethal violence, but he often plans more to not do it because he's aware that the more you use it, the more it kind of makes you lazy, and the more heat you attract from law enforcement and these sorts of things. So he is capable of sort of taking a rounded approach to these things, even though ethically he has no problem with it whatsoever. He So he has this kind of like trying to hold the pieces together, and he's like this when we meet him. The first book is the one that's most like a thriller, and you can tell that I think you can tell that Westlake did not necessarily consider this a series. It reads pretty good as just a one and done, but apparently it was his editor liked it enough, or it was popular enough that he went ahead and did some more. And some of the early ones have a theme of Parker versus organized crime. Parker is like an independent armed robber in the ecosystem of other independent armed robbers, and they, occasionally come into conflict with organized crime, and that gives you a nice arc. Independent criminals versus organized criminals. Who's going to win? The little guy. There were a bunch of movies in this era that had a similar theme, like a very good one actually, directed by Don Siegel, called Charlie Varick. I recommend that if anyone wants to see Walter Matthau acting tough and saying Elmer Leonard type lines. It's pretty good. Uh, but as the series goes on, it becomes more just how do you do this? How do you plan like a major armed robbery? How do you go through with it? What barriers arrive, and then how do you respond? And of course, one of the appeals of crime fiction is, since the characters are criminals and not bound by the usual laws or the usual norms of law abiding, you can put them in some pretty unusual situations that get pretty, symbolic and dramatic and kind of fascinating. One of the most liked books, I think, in the series is from the first run in the early 70s. There was a book called Slayground, and it's quite contrived, but people love it. It's something like Die Hard. Parker is trying to escape a robbery gone wrong, and he flees into an abandoned amusement park. And the money that he was trying to rob turns out to be mafia money, and the mafia think that he might still have it, and so they go in after him. And then it becomes this kind of one man, like Die Hard. It's this like one tough, smart person in a complicated environment against a whole group of people who are trying to catch him. And beat by beat, scene by scene, you get these setups and payoffs where Parker leads them into traps, or has to improvise or use some unexpected route to get around them. It's really good. If it's never made into a movie, I'm quite surprised. Maybe it's already been, anyone who did it now would be accused of ripping off Die Hard, but at the time, of course, the book came out far before. So because the characters are criminals, you can set them in these really artificial situations with at least a veneer of plausibility, and that's a lot of fun. It's fun to imagine truly crazy things happening, in the real world, side by side, with just regular daily life. That, like, the car speeding by you on the highway doesn't just have some people in it. It has, like, a hostage and a gunman and a guy who's agreed to pay the ransom, and this sort of thing. This is, I think, also the key pleasure to other good major crime writers like Elmore Leonard. Leonard gives a lot of credit to Westlake, of course, for sort of like helping create the style and the directness of the kind of fiction that Leonard would write. Because there's no wasted words in the Parker books. There's no wasted words at all. Parker basically never muses on things. He stays focused and directed, and he keeps track of what's available to him in his environment. He's not invincible by any means. He makes mistakes. He's fooled. Bad luck. He has good odds against him, which of course makes it, pleasurable when he overcomes those odds, or when you see what exactly trips him up, or what he would have preferred not to happen but did happen, and how he's going to respond to that. And the way he responds to it always is cooling down even more and staying even more focused. You watch his focus just narrow. Like, there's is one of the early books where he and his group of thieves pull a job in on a sports stadium. They steal the ticket concessions and get away with a lot of money, and a whole bunch of stuff goes wrong in this one. The way I remember it is not only do they lose the money, but some of them are killed and the police are pulled in, and there's really a big question of whether they're going to get away. And Parker, of course, doesn't want to get away without the money. He's really deeply focused on the money. He's perfectly willing to run major risks if he thinks there's still a chance of getting the money, and he has to follow it as through twists and turns. The people who they initially think might have it turn out to not have it, and it just turns into this kind of scene out of the Terminator, where the person with the money is desperately trying to get away and Parker is just following them remorselessly. The whole last 20 or 30 pages are basically just a manhunt between these two guys on their own, as one is just trying to get away or somehow placate or slow down or delay Parker, and Parker just pushes through. It's pretty compelling storytelling because it fits. We've accepted this about Parker as a character, is that he just won't stop. And of course, in regular life, we have to make concessions and compromises. And what if we too just didn't stop? What if we just had the ability mentally and the sort of the freedom to just stay focused on what we want, and we had narrowed down what we want to just one thing: money. I mentioned vengeance. Parker does take, it's implied, some mild pleasure in vengeance of itself, although his vengeance is usually instrumental. He does have some interest in sex, but it's really it's not much. It's really underplayed, and as the series goes on, it just sort of seems to drip away even further. But it's sometimes implied that once he's done these, that the way he feels about a successful armed robbery is sort of the way he would feel about a successful seduction. That it's sort of like the idea of doing these crimes is sort of linked to his sex drive. But fundamentally, he's about money, and it's not even about spending it. He doesn't do anything with it. I mean, he lives okay, but he doesn't take any deep hedonistic pleasure. He never seems to be happy because he's got nice clothes or he's got a car. He just mostly has it. At the one point I remember latest in the series, he does have this money. He often succeeds in getting away with money, good sums. He just hides it. He just hides it in the walls of his. He just hides it in the walls of this house. It's very. I mean, it's a fairly common symbol, which is just having the money. It's not about what you can do with the money. It's just the money is sort of a symbol of success, and really it's about the work. And so then the question becomes: we know so little about Parker beyond this obsession with doing armed robbery, and sort of doing it really well, doing it right. Covering all the bases. He always neglects something. Something always goes wrong, but he never seems to lose the idea of doing it right. Which is actually similar, now that I think on it, to the actual bank robber Willie Sutton, who I'm sure Westlake was aware of. So maybe there was a slight impact there on his portrayal of Parker. Willie Sutton was a safe cracker and a bank robber, and also a prison escape artist. He would go to prison and then he would work out how to break out, and he was really focused on the technical side of things really, really well, to the point that numerous law enforcement officers said, Willie, you could put these skills to a different use. You're really good at this. You don't have to use it for crime. You could do other things with these skills. And he couldn't help it. He had a sort of fixation on robbing banks and then breaking out of prisons. And he always seemed to screw up when it came to assembling crews of people to help him, and knowing who to trust and how things are going to break down, which often is also what plagues Parker, is that, the other people, he can rely on himself, and he tends to know often who he can rely on for other parts of the job, but never perfectly. And there's always more people involved than you think, and these people have secrets or secret motives, and these things, once exposed, Parker doesn't waste any time wondering how things could have been or how they could have gone better. He just tries to understand the situation and then refocus on the goal. And so the question then becomes, we know so little about him, and yet he's so good at this and he's so focused on it, and this seems to be all he wants out of life. How did he ever get this way? Who acts like this? Who becomes like this? We can, not everyone is like this. We do occasionally see parts of the world through the eyes of other characters, usually the criminals working with Parker or the people teaming up um, with him, or occasionally other characters. But we do see other characters in the world, and other of these people, they have goals. Like, they rob because they want the money to do something, or because they enjoy the action, or they like the high living, or it's whatever. But Parker's so cold about it. He's just like Terminator style. He's almost robotic about it. How did he get like that? It's this like deep mystery of how did he become the kind of person to just kind of narrow his will and then focus onto this one thing, when, like Willie Sutton, the skills he has would allow him to succeed in other endeavors, but it's like he just chose this and loves it to the degree that he doesn't even think about it anymore, and he becomes like that almost at the start. um, Lee Marvin said that's partly what drew him to playing the role in Point Blank, in the movie based off the first Parker book, is he just loved how unresponsive the character was to other people, and how hard, cold, robotic, that he was, and wanted to portray that, and did it very well. It's a pretty good movie. Interestingly, I think I mentioned Westlake didn't want to let anyone else use the name Parker. So after he died, whatever happened to his work, the very next, just a few years later, Jason Statham was in a movie adapted from one of the Parker books, and the title was just Parker. Almost like somebody was bragging that they'd finally gotten the rights to use the name of the character, and they were so happy they were just going to call the movie Parker. It's not good. It was a complete waste of of good stories. Um, anyway, that's kind of like the mystery. That's the fascination of a character of whom we know so little. Similar, I think, now that I say it out loud, to the Ripley books by Patricia Highsmith. Ripley, of course, is this sort of sociopath who's got a real gift for murder and for getting away with it, and hiding bodies and thinking through alibis and things like this. And the question, of course, becomes, how the heck did he become like this? Where did he, with Ripley, we know a little more about what he likes and doesn't like, but there's still this deep mystery in his past about how did he become the kind of person who just chose to live this kind of life, who imagined himself doing these sorts of things. How do you become someone who just imagines living as an armed robber, and then how do you watch them interact with other people who all have various different goals, and what they think of them? When are they drawn to them? When aren't they? What do they learn to expect from them? What don't they? Parker does have some of his fellow thieves at least seem to think of him with something like friendship, or at least they find him reliable. And he also has the occasional relationship with a non-thief. The main one is a woman he meets during one of the jobs, who even starts a relationship with him. And I remember the deepest I remember getting into what he feels about her is he's taking care of her, and she's living in his house and spending his money, and she comes back from some shopping trip to New York, and she models all of the clothes she bought. And the deepest I can remember, he says something like, this is almost it, is something like, Parker watched her, taking on and off the dresses. He liked watching her. It felt good to watch her dress up for him. That's it. Like, that's it. There's no deeper insight. It's just, he feels good. Okay, let's do that. Yeah, nice. Okay, now on to the next thing. It's very empty. And how do you become so empty? What you need to know enough about a character in a long series in formulaic fiction to know what makes them tick, but you can't ever know completely what makes them tick or how exactly they would respond to each variance of their situation, or there would be no drama or interest in walking through. Like, Parker will occasionally, very, very occasionally, show little signs of sadism. He'll sometimes show signs of mercy. He does have some variance, but mostly his life is so narrow, so constricted, so obsessed with doing this one complicated thing, and then living out the implications of that obsession, that you watch him interact with this wider world, and you pretty much know that most of it just doesn't interest him. And I wonder if that's something that people actually aspire to, is to be know what in the world they should just are safe just completely ignoring. Because for Parker it's almost everything. He's interested in money, specifically through armed robbery. He has the occasional interest in sex, and he has the occasional interest in vengeance or sadism. Um, Although even there, these are both usually in the service of the larger obsession. So, what would it be like to be someone like that, who then narrowly focused on getting better at this very specific, unusual thing? Probably something like our fascination with people who really build their lives around a single craft, like golf or playing the piano, or um, or dealing options. I knew someone once who just they learned, this is in the old days of the market, they just learned to spot option ways to make money selling and buying options, and they just did that over and over and over. And what would that kind of life be like? Because it's not a kind of life that most of us seem to often have the option to choose. Most of us are in a position of having to meet wider commitments and developing much wider values and balancing them against each other. But what if we had just chosen that narrow focus? What if we had just dug down into it and put everything else in the service of it, so that any other goal we pursue, any other value, ultimately had to be measured against the main one? What would that be like? And then what if what we had chosen was crime? You can see why people like these books. Okay, more Donald Westlake soon. Talk about a book he wrote around 1974 called Cops and Robbers.